Unfortunately, we didn't invest in eBay. But Gavin also, being an entrepreneur, said that there'd be one slight change at lunch given the shortage of food. That he's decided to take a leaf out of eBay's book, and lunch will be auctioned today. Now, there's always a risk at a conference like this, and I think the normal tendency is to bombard everybody with statistics and data. And when contemplating what I should talk about today, the natural topic obviously was China, and I thought that were I to do that, I would be the most ignorant person in the room, because I suspect that everyone here, those who live in China, those who are investing in China, know far more about the topic than I do. And I also didn't want to run the risk here of turning this talk into what they all too frequently degenerate into, which is a self-advertisement or an advertisement for the firm which one's associated with. So instead, and this is a little risky, I thought I'd talk about a topic that certainly at the outset may seem to have no relevance whatsoever to the topic at hand, which is China and venture capital, but which I hope, as I proceed through the slides, you'll begin to understand may have tremendous relevance to what we are all thinking about, what you're going to spend the rest of the day talking about, and perhaps what might evolve over the next 25 years as China and the venture capital business and new companies become more and more intertwined. So today I would like to talk about something that doesn't have an engine, doesn't have a motor, doesn't have any moving parts, doesn't have any wheels, doesn't have any sails, doesn't have any electronics. I'd like to talk about the box and the packet. And I'd like to talk primarily about the box rather than the IP packet. And much of this is drawn from a very interesting book that came out a couple of weeks ago, written by a gentleman called Mark Levinson, who is an economist and who has studied with a degree of considerable fascination the evolution of the box, the evolution of the container. And oddly enough, this is a very appropriate week to talk about the container, because quite coincidentally, tomorrow, April the 26th, 2006, marks the precise 50th anniversary to the day of when the first container ship sailed from Newark, New Jersey. And the evolution of the container business over the last 50 years has, I think, a tremendous number of comparables and analogies with the evolution that we all find ourselves in the midst of, which is the evolution of the IP packet. We are probably halfway through the evolution of the business around the IP packet, 25 years or so, as today marks, or tomorrow marks, the 50th anniversary of the sailing of the first container ship. Now, at the risk of being a little bit nostalgic, I want to take you back in time to and give you a snapshot of what the world looked like before the revolution of the technology surrounding the complete system, industrial system that's being built around the world of the container. This is New York in the early 1950s. This is industry before the container had really wrought all the tremendous changes which it's done over the last half century. This is the typical way in which Macy's in Midtown Manhattan was supplied with garments. The garments for Macy's were made in upstate New York, or they were made in downtown Manhattan. And this is a picture of a typical seamstress working in a loft in downtown Manhattan, just a couple of miles from the Macy's store. Imagine, and I don't think anyone would have been able to imagine in the mid-1950s, that 50 years hence, it would be cheaper for Macy's to acquire its garments from factories in China or the Orient or India, and far more efficient than to go 2 miles downtown to buy apparel from a loft like the one in this picture. Picture 2, excuse me. This, and I'll get a little nostalgic here, this is one of my earliest memories. When I was a child, 4 or 5 years, well actually 5 or 6 years old, I sailed with my parents to West Africa, from Liverpool in England. And one of my earliest recollections as a child is standing on a quayside in Liverpool, which was one of the great shipping ports of the Western world in the late 1950s, watching all of our household goods, including my father's prized possession, his second-hand automobile, being shipped or being ready for shipping to West Africa from the United Kingdom. And it's hard for us today to remember the amount of labor, the amount of time, the amount of effort, the amount of work that was associated with the shipment, the preparation, and the transportation of physical goods. This snapshot that you're looking at perhaps gives you a sense of the mess, the confusion that took place at the side of docks. And since that point, I don't want to paint a picture of unimpeded, rapid, smooth growth in the evolution of the container business. Yesterday's packet business, the containers obviously being the shipments of physical goods, and the packet that we all relish being the shipper of digital goods. There have been lots of bumps and fits and starts, and a lot of what has happened in the evolution of that business has been unpredictable. There have been huge price swings. Companies have gone, companies have come. There have been unpredictable business cycles. There have been entrepreneurs who've stubbed their toes and gone bankrupt. There have been plenty of trial and error, large sums lost and large sums made. And here, too, you get a sense of the high amount of labor associated in the mid-1950s with the shipment of anything. And I think this slide and the next slide give you a sense of the amount of money, the amount of time, the amount of cost, the amount of labor associated with shipments prior to the age of the container. And I'll give you some statistics here. When goods were shipped in the 1950s, 75% or so of the cost of the transportation was actually associated with passage through the docks, storage in the docks, handling of the goods, and placement aboard the ships. The United States government did a study in the mid-1950s of a typical 5,000-ton vessel plying international waters, and discovered that, believe it or not, there were 190,000 different packages separately stowed on this vessel. And this was a vessel that was sailing between the East Coast and Bremerhaven in Germany. And it took, from the time one of these items was shipped out of the factory in the US to the time it arrived at its eventual destination in Germany, it took 95 days. And the cost of the transportation was about 25% of the value of all the goods that were shipped. There was clearly something massively wrong and inefficient with the physical transportation system of the 1950s. And along came this gentleman, an entrepreneur, a gentleman called Malcolm McLean, who grew up in North Carolina and who, in his dotage in later years, wound up owning and developing a very famous golf course back east called Pinehurst. But he developed his notoriety for building a company called Sealand. He, earlier in his life, had been a trucker, and then had thought that there has to be a better way of moving physical goods, and developed the first container. And tomorrow, as I said before, marks the 50th anniversary of the first containers that this gentleman, Malcolm McLean, put aboard a ship called the Ideal X that sailed from Newark to Houston. And aboard that ship were 58 truck bodies. And on that first voyage, he estimated that instead of costing almost $6 a ton to ship those particular goods, it sliced the cost to about 16 cents. And I have a picture here of, not the first ship, because I couldn't find an image, but this is a Matson Line ship, one that would have sailed from San Francisco to John Dean's home state, Hawaii. In fact, John can be spotted as a young boy on the bridge of that vessel. You can see him right there. And for all of us who are now used to seeing these massive container ships, this is a quaint relic of the past. But this was the second container ship that was ever developed. And you can see how few containers are sitting on it. So this is a picture of life at the end of the 1950s in the container business. And I want to give you a sense of how long it takes before manufacturers, entrepreneurs, the actual people who made, and companies who shipped goods rather than carriers themselves, really came to benefit from all the tremendous changes. I've given you a little snapshot, I hope, of what life was like in the 1950s. It wasn't really until 30 years later that business and international trade really began to take advantage of the container industry that had been gradually built and assembled over the course of the previous 25 years. And I would submit to you that in 2006 we approached very much in the same position that the shipping business was perched in 1980. So I want to give you a sense of all the different bits and pieces that had to come together in order to be to enable the enormous trade that now takes place. Because back at the time that John was sailing aboard this Matson steamer, most of the trade that took place with the limited number of containers was actually local trade, domestic trade, not international trade. So a whole variety of things had to come into place. There were cranes, there were railroads, there were trucking systems, there were industry standards. And this, today, is obviously a familiar part of the industrial landscape, but back at the time when the first container ships were being shipped and sailed around the world, many of them actually had their own cranes actually on the ships themselves to onload and offload the goods. And the throughput at the port systems had to be totally revitalized with the installation of custom-built, purpose-built cranes like this. And today, obviously, we see these pterodactyls at every port, but they were very unfamiliar sights. And the installations of cranes probably took more than 20 years and didn't take place in ports like Manhattan, ports like Liverpool, ports like London, but elsewhere, as I'll point out in a few minutes. And then, one of the major problems that everybody had as they began to think about the world of containers was the fact that railroads were very balkanized, particularly in the United States. And prior to the bankruptcy surrounding the Penn Central Railroad at the beginning of the 1970s, railroads didn't want to have anything to do with the shipment of containers, even though that would seem a very foreign concept to us today. There were different sized boxes. Different railroads had different approaches to containers. Some of them didn't want to have anything whatsoever to do with containers because they saw them as a real big threat to their traditional freight good business. And it probably took, from the time that the first container ship sailed, almost 25 years before railroads, under a lot of pressure from Congress and elsewhere, began to embrace the notion that the container actually was a wonderful boon to them and a real help for their business. Similarly, the trucking business in the United States, the trucking business under enormous pressure from the unions, prior to deregulation in 1980, so this is 25 years after the Matson steamer sailed. It was really only in the 1980s that the trucking business, after deregulation, after, interestingly for all of us, the advent of real private enterprise and breaking of prices in the trucking business, began to prosper and introduce the notion of what you see in this picture, which is the piggyback trailer. And so several things had to happen. You had to have the shippers, you had to, or the shipping fleets, you had to have the cranes, you had to have the railroads, you had to have the trucks. Think today where we stand with routers and networks and Wi-Fi and last mile and broadband and mobile phones and notebook computers, and begin to see the sense of the whole infrastructure that has to take place before, in the topic of today, physical goods, in the topic of tomorrow, digital goods, can get moved across this system. And lying behind all of this was, oddly though it may seem to us, ISO, the International Standards Organization, which spent 10 years during the 1960s dealing with dueling nations, all of whom had vested interests in the way that goods flowed. And it took 5 or 6 years before the International Standards Body could settle on a form of container that would be satisfactory for all the different vested interests, different countries, different railroads, different shippers. So over the course of 20 years, standards came into being, and a whole industry began to mobilize around the shipment of physical goods. And so today there have been very significant and massive changes that, if this clicker works, we all know that. John Dean is not on the bridge of this vessel. He's busy flying over it. But today, 50 years after this first vessel with 58 containers sailed, 300 million 20-foot containers are shipped by sea. And remember how I mentioned how long it took those goods to move from the East Coast to Germany 50 years ago. Today, if you want to ship containers full of coffee makers, a 35-ton load from Malaysia, say, to Ohio, a distance of 11,000 miles, you could do that in 22 days, and the shipping cost would be lower than a single first-class air ticket between those two areas. So picture what's happened also in the world of communications, where today communications has suddenly become free, and the voyage of packets around the world takes place in milliseconds. So what are the consequences of all this? One of the consequences is what you see here, which is a whole array of Walmart containers at a shipping dock, a Walmart distribution center. Walmart, Dell, Toyota, Apple Computer, a whole bunch of other companies that we're all familiar with. Their businesses, the founders of those companies, the entrepreneurs, the really imaginative managers behind the older companies like Toyota have developed, would not have happened without their physical incarnation of our packet, which for them was the container. This is a difficult slide, my only slide with data, which is a picture of what's happened around the world in the last 25 years, as some people have embraced the future, and other countries and individuals and people and vested interests have tried to fend off the future. This is the evolution of the world's largest container ports over the last 10 to 15 years. And you will notice the ones in red did not exist. I'm missing a couple of symbols here. This is 1990 and 2005. My apologies. But you can see that several ports, Shenzhen and others, were either far smaller or didn't exist 15 years ago and have benefited tremendously by their willingness to embrace change in the future and make very large and sizable investments. And I think the same obviously will go in the digital world that we're living in. This is what happens when you don't embrace the future. This is the thriving, bustling seaport of Manhattan. It's now a pleasure complex. This is a picture of the Chelsea piers, deserted. Take a picture 50 years ago, these piers were full of steamships. This is a picture of the bustling, thriving seaport once called San Francisco. Take a look at each of those piers, and maybe you can find a ferry to Larkspur. Maybe you can spot a few seals, but you will not see any trade or transportation taking place, as we all know, in the city of San Francisco. This is the port that I referred to, that I remember as a small child. This was the greatest industrial port of all time at one point, the city of Liverpool, utterly deserted. I'll point out that between 1965 and 1975 in New York, there were 1.4 million days of longshore stevedore labor used in 1964. 10 years later, that number had dropped to 120,000, a drop of 91% within 10 years. And maybe there are comparables in the world that we're living in today, where stevedores and longshoremen are called engineers and programmers. So there are tremendous consequences where local markets have scarcely exist, cost has gone away, distance matters very little, time has been whittled down, And most of the stuff that gets moved around the world in containers are components and unfinished goods. These are the beneficiaries. This is what happens when you embrace the future. A thriving container port when none existed. This is a picture of Shenzhen. This next one is a picture of Shanghai. This next one is a picture of Hong Kong. And, bear with me, we'll find out. The next slide, please. This, imagine these products. Apples from New Zealand, components for Toyota automobiles, food from Italy, Apple iPods, Patagonia fleeces, things as valuable as the Barbie doll. All of these things that were pretty unavailable 15, 20 years ago were brought to you as the benefit of standardization around a traffic system called containers. And today, I think, and maybe our work together over the course of the next 20 years, is to figure out what we can do with our equivalent of the container, which is the internet packet. The container, in its time, left nothing untouched. It had very unpredictable repercussions on lots of businesses and lots of industries. Fortunes were won and fortunes were lost along the way. But it brought about a vast technological revolution. We have, all of us here in Silicon Valley, all of us associated with technology in China, have our own container to begin to develop for. And that's the challenge and the opportunity that all of us have over the next 25 years. And I hope I can just leave you with the one question. I've tried to illustrate what the container has done, and I've posed the question for all of us is, what can we together enable the packet to do? Thank you very much.
Open for a question or two. We're full now.
What about no intellectual property associated with container? And I think if you look at some of the more successful internet companies, I remember when we invested in some of them, particularly a company like Yahoo, everybody felt that there was no intellectual property associated with this company and that it was very easy to knock off. And I think some of the big consumer companies that have been very successful, there is a tremendous amount of intellectual property associated with the way in which they do business. For anybody who has looked at the way in which Toyota has improved itself over the last 25 years, or Yahoo has developed, or Walmart has developed its information systems, there is a tremendous amount of intellectual property associated with this. I think you're addressing, obviously, a more thorny topic, which is China and intellectual property, and it isn't a subject that I'm going to go anywhere near. I think there are a lot of smarter people more versed in that than I am.
I have a question here. I mean, looking at the history of container business, if you're looking at a truck or shipping business,
We don't put that point clearly enough because it was one that struck me as I was reading up on this material. And I think, again, like all analogies, I apologize for the strain of it, but if you think about the shipping lines as carriers in our world, I think the money accrues to the people who take advantage of the carriers. The money accrues to Apple Computer and Toyota and Dell and Walmart and everybody else who allows their goods to flow atop the shipping lines or be buried inside of the container. And I think that's going to be true today as we embrace the internet and the world of mobile. It is what we put in the packets, how we package what we put in the packets, and that flows over the infrastructure, that flows over these standardized systems that have been rolled out around the world, where the real beneficiaries will be. But it will take imagination on the part of entrepreneurs. When the world of containers showed up at the doorstep of manufacturers, originally they didn't know what to do with it because they'd always been, they had shipped their goods and thought about shipments in a very different fashion. So a whole bunch of new people and new competitors arrived who were able to capture the benefits. And I think the same will be true today as we move into the world of, you know, the universally connected broadband IP packet, where you will have some older companies that make the ship, but there could be any number of fantastic opportunities for people thinking about things that they can put in packets, ship to people all over the world, deliver great things for their customers of value or information or entertainment, where they will accrue the benefits. So I think the benefits over the long term here are going to accrue to the people who take advantage of this communications infrastructure that is being deployed, has been partially deployed, but is going to continue to get deployed over the next 25 years. Hope that helps a little.
One last question.
Michael, we enjoy your time. To be made all the way up and down the food chain, and people in this room, I'm sure, invest in silicon all the way up to application services. So if you disassemble our chain of, or if you take a look at our complete enormous menu of investment opportunities, I think you can invest in cranes, I think you can invest in shipping fleets, I think you can invest in financial services that surround the development of these sorts of things. And then I think you can invest in all the stuff that goes inside of them. So whether it's the silicon that forms the infrastructure of wide area switches or routers or WiMAX devices or new cell phones, plenty of opportunities there. Pop up a level or several levels to the software infrastructure that binds all of this together, plenty of opportunity there. And then at the application level, again, a myriad of opportunities. I think we're still, as I said at the beginning, we're in the late 1970s of the particular business that we're all for. If you go back to my strained analogy, we're only in 1979, which is fantastic news. Sometime, 30, 40 years from now, somebody's going to come back and paint a similar picture for the evolution of our industry and business, and I think there are going to be all sorts of wonderful, unpredictable surprises along the way.
You join me now again.